Okay, so the next element of narration that I wanted to talk a little bit about with Professor C is the element known as irony. So I think irony is, out of all of these, is probably one of the most difficult to explain. The simplest explanation that most people will offer is when you expect one thing and something else, generally the opposite, is what actually occurs.
Pretty much equated to everyday life.
Do you see it that way, Chris? Is that kind of how you would define
Yes.
irony?
Yeah. There's contradicting meanings. So it's kind of broad. It seems complicated, but you can kind of run with this a little bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of people will confuse just simple contradiction with irony, but there's more.
Yes.
When you want to describe irony. It's not a contradiction. It's really that sense that it didn't quite go the way you had expected to. In fact, it turned out quite the opposite. So the people might be familiar with the term just desserts. That's what generally comes to mind when I think of irony is you think that one person's going to get something, and it turns out that they may get something quite the opposite of what they expected. So anyway, it's just a weak example. But anyway, we've got the definition on the course. Go in and look, and if you're not sure, do a little bit of independent research just to make sure that you're clear on it if you're going to respond to it. So in this story, I mean, I tried to avoid too many of the obvious examples of irony. There are a few that run through the whole story. The one thing that I would say is one irony that I felt in this story was the fact that the murder itself is not what caused his guilt. That the murder really only came to light because of his own guilt. So I thought that was a bit of an irony there, as I'm assuming that everybody's read the story before they've tried to look at this video. I'm going to arrange it that way on the website when we're done. But I think when you get to the end of the story, I find that that's kind of an irony in the story, is this murder probably would have gone unknown if it hadn't been for the murderer himself. So I do think that that's an ironic twist to the story. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to make it too complicated, but that was one that surprisingly, students don't always come up with that. So I thought I'd put that one out there first. So anyway, Professor Chris, what did you find ironic in this story, The Telltale Hat?
Well, I chose irony in the sense of that contradiction of meanings, how you can have a same situation, event, or whatever, or phrase or story, yet it means something different. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I chose, again, I like to play with words a little bit. And I chose actually his choice of word, foresight, which I thought was funny for a few different reasons. Because in his writings, the expectations regarding the old man's eye, that the eye itself is bound to evil power, right? Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is the old man lacks eyesight, foresight, So I feel that there's a little bit of like dark humor here, and that this is what I mean about contradicting meanings. Mm-hmm. What does he mean about foresight? Because the old man's eye is blind, but he uses the word foresight.
And I do think that's interesting too, like you said, because it is a blind eye, and yet in many ways the eye itself foreshadows what is to come in the story. So right. It's kind of like looking ahead, as opposed, that's a very interesting twist on it.
Yes, and that's what I mean with Poe. I think these things are intentional. What he chose, choosing this word, because mm-hmm. he did have a very dark sense of humor. Mm-hmm. And he does play with these things. So I try to use a lot more words, if I could, as opposed, and I like your way of like thematically even choosing illusion, which I never really quite thought of things in those terms. And this is, again, the reason why you thought it would be good to bring it to the table. No, I'm referring to the illusion. Mm-hmm. Not irony.
I don't want to confuse the audience.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
The first narrative narrative of Oh my gosh, elements of
Element
narration.
of narration.
Yeah, I couldn't get it out. I was saying it backwards. That's ironic, right? No.
And it is funny because, I mean, even though the revelation, which is what you would expect of having foresight, does
Yes.
not it's not revealed by seeing something.
No.
It's revealed by saying something. So
Correct.
yeah, it really does kind of underscore where the story goes.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's so layered. That's why I said with Poe, he's very complex.
Hmm. Okay, very good. All right, so that's irony, and then we'll next go on to our next element of narration.